Hello and welcome to the Biz Coach Show, hosted by my Biz Coaches and presented by the TLG Group. Our show is focused on giving entrepreneurs the edge they need to succeed. Your hosts today are David Macon, that's me, and Eric Whitmore. Eric, how are you on this awesome Friday?
I am phenomenal, David. Thank you very much.
Awesome, cool. Well, always good to hang out with you. And we have a special guest today. Let's take a minute to meet our guest. Our guest today is Robyn Bowles. After earning her master's degree from Cornell, Robyn spent 25 years in corporate human resources. In 2021, she left corporate America behind to own and operate her own Schooley Mitchell franchise, which is North America's largest independent cost reduction consultants. Robyn now works with businesses of all shapes and sizes to help them identify and reduce costs. Robyn, it is so great to have you with us today. How are you doing today?
I am fabulous, David. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, no, we're great to have you with us, and we're excited for the episode. I know we've got a lot of good stuff that we're going to walk through with you. And speaking of great episodes, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, be sure to do so, whether that's on YouTube or any of our podcast platforms. And that way you don't miss future episodes with great guests, just like Robyn, and lots of great information for small business owners. So before we jump into our topic for today, which is cost consciousness, Robyn, maybe tell us just a bit more about yourself or Schooley Mitchell. We'd love to get to know a little bit more about you and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. As you guys mentioned in the intro, Schooley Mitchell is North America's largest independent cost reduction company. And the word independent is important because our clients need to know that when we bring recommendations to them, it's not because we're a reseller or a broker and we're getting commission from a certain vendor. We're bringing them recommendations based on what is best for them and their business. So it's been in existence since around 1998, headquartered up near Toronto. We have about 250 or so franchises across the US and Canada, and probably about 125 and growing people at home office. So it's a growing organization.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Yeah. And thanks for giving us that rundown. And yeah, it sounds like you guys do a lot, work with a lot of different companies on a lot of different things to reduce costs, which is perfect for our topic today. So I guess maybe just to start out at a high level, what are maybe some of the common areas where businesses can find cost savings?
Yeah. Some of our big hitters obviously are credit card processing. I mean, that's a huge area for lots of businesses. Waste. And when we talk about waste, we talk about anything you pay to get rid of. So it could be medical waste, food waste, regular waste, shredding, composting, you name it. It could also be telecom. And that for us is anything from internet, cell phones, landlines, tablets, all of that. And then shipping. Shipping's another area where if companies are shipping out particularly small packages less than 150 pounds, those charges go up every year too.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot, right? And that covers everything from hospitals to restaurants and like everything in between. So pretty big group there.
Yeah, we have a lot of other, smaller areas. We just are getting into uniforms and linens, as well as facility services, which is another big area for a lot of companies. So every year, Schooley Mitchell takes a look at kind of commodity-based expenses, and they test it out pretty thoroughly to make sure that we can actually drive cost savings. And then if it works, they introduce it to all the franchisees.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that's great. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I was going to say, I got a quick question for you. So, Robyn, in regards to the, like, for instance, telecom, David and I come from a long time in the industry. So what is a common, or what are some of the more common examples that you find, particularly with the telecom or even the internet or some of those other options, where owners have made mistakes or maybe not paid attention to and consequently are paying for services that they didn't think about? Or what? Give us some common examples that you run into with that.
Honestly, common examples are just losing track of numbers and phones. From big businesses to very small nonprofits, we are saving people and finding thousands of dollars in savings because maybe they have 30 cell phones, but actually they're only using 25. 5 people left and they forgot to shut those lines off. They have 2 accounts for the same phone line somehow. Or it's just really for telecom, a lot of times it just comes, people just overlook those things. They're hard to keep track of, particularly in businesses where employees come and go a lot.
Mhm.
Some have a cell phone, a tablet, and a phone line, and they're gone. And next thing you know, that business has continued to pay for that for about 6 months.
Yeah, great point. Appreciate that. I know when I had my trucking business, all of our drivers had equipment. Both tablets were mounted into the trucks. Then we had repeaters for the trailers, and then in addition to that, we had cell phones for each of the drivers. Just managing that was probably, I'm going to guess, a half a day, at least a half a day a month, if not maybe even a full day a month of work for somebody within the office to track all that down and keep it up tabs on all of it. So I can imagine that a lot of people forget things.
Yeah, in fact, we have some larger clients that once they're done with their original service agreement and we've saved them all the money we can save with their plans, they actually will continue to pay Schoolie Mitchell on an hourly basis just to do the MACDs for them because they don't have
Really?
anyone that can do it. So we'll monitor the invoices every month. We have programs that will run and say, hey, this phone number hasn't been used in 90 days. Do you want us to shut it off for you? So we'll have people just pay for that service.
Crazy. That one, it doesn't surprise me because I say,
Yeah.
we experienced that briefly, and then in the industry, that was always an opportunity.
Yes.
And then one other question I had for you is that when you're what's Schoolie Mitchell, or what's more specifically your stance when it comes to insurance on these electronic equipment?
I try not to have a stance. I think it depends on a lot of different factors. Obviously, what equipment you're getting. What does your workforce look like? I think the insurance needs of the 22-year-old employee who may not be around that long versus I'm giving this equipment to a very well-established professional. I think you might look at those two plans very differently. So I think it depends on a lot of factors. I think the most important thing is a business needs to understand what that insurance policy is. What is the deductible? What are the payments? Are you going to get the same phone? Or are you going to get a refurbished phone? So I think there's a lot of pieces that go into it. I would never rush in to get insurance, but in certain circumstances, again, given all those factors, it might make sense.
Yeah, great point. I bring that up because you made that comment in our presentation this past weekend at the event, and you talked about that. And I've always been a relatively strong proponent of it, mostly because having come from the industry, I often would sell that to people. But consequently, when you back into the numbers and you figure out in many cases what's the cost of acquisition to reacquire, right? To your point, am I getting a comparable unit, or are they going to? And I've seen that where they get the less than desirable piece of equipment that's now the replacement because the technology advances so quickly that what you had is right, and so it's now I've got to replace all the ancillary equipment that goes along with it on top of that because it's a different piece of equipment than when I originally started with. So all the chargers might not be the same. The cradles that I'm using in my vehicles might not be there's so many different factors. And so consequently, I'm like, in the end, I don't think I saved any money by having the insurance.
I think it's probably one of those things that would be good to review on a yearly basis. So as the technology gets a year older, your workforce maybe look different. Maybe each year you look at each piece of equipment and say, does it still make sense?
Right. Yeah, appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting as you were talking about that, Robyn. I was thinking as businesses, grow rapidly or get larger and larger, these issues get larger and larger, right? The phone lines, right? All of those sorts of things. And I think the manpower and the hours it takes to manage it, certainly what you're talking about makes sense of bringing in an independent consultant to really look at that. So thanks for sharing that.
Oh, no problem. And quite honestly, we can do it pretty efficiently because we have proprietary software that can review those invoices, where a business, you're going to pay somebody to go line by line and figure it out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
And I don't
We're all
want that.
about efficiency. Awesome. Well, let's maybe think about for a minute if we've got somebody who's watching this or listening to it and they're suddenly realizing, oh my goodness, I need to start doing this. What's the best way for them to determine where they should be focusing their cost management efforts?
Mm-hmm. I think it starts with a pretty simple analysis of where your money is going, which obviously is going to be different based on your company size and your industry. But, as simple as obviously personnel is almost always the largest cost for a business, but then invert all of your other expenses. What is the next biggest thing you spend money on? And sort those in that order. Having said that, here's the other thing I would say though is don't forget those little things because those add up. Those little expenses that people take for granted and they just keep paying that bill every month. those things can really add up. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. It's absolutely look at the big hitters and find out where you can save money, but don't ignore a whole segment of cost just because it's not as much as, say, your personnel line.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the exercises we do when we do cost cutting with our clients, when we do it like and I've shared with you before, Robyn, we kind of do a preliminary, like where are some of the opportunities. We'll take the P&L, we'll which most people don't. It's not that they don't know how to do it; they just don't take the time to do it. But basically, do a percentage of gross revenue, right? And now I've got a percentage of gross revenue. I sort it top to bottom, so highest to lowest, right? And so to your point, payroll is going to be first. Rents are often up there. Other equipment expenditures and things like that. And then you get into the nuances of running the business. And to your point, you could get, there could be 10 line items in there, but when you aggregate those 10 line items add up to 10 or 15% of your gross margin. And the reality is the business is operating at a 10 or 12% net margin. And there's 10% of aggregated services, and I can shave off 0.5% out of those 10 categories. That's another 5% net margins going to the business. On $1 million business, that's $50,000 going back into the bottom line.
Yep.
Right. So it doesn't take much, even in a relatively smaller business with only $1 million in gross revenue, to put $50,000 back in the owner's pocket. They just have to have the discipline to go and do through the process. So in your particular case, you actually do a lot of that on their behalf, or at least some of the categories anyway, the primary category.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And as you were talking, I was thinking, looking at what you currently have, what you're spending money on, what your costs are, that's one part of it. But there's also the other piece of it of, thinking about purchasing something new. So maybe we talk about that for a minute is how do we ensure that we are getting the best value out of those new purchases? What should we be looking for? What should owners be thinking about?
I think that really comes down to knowledge. And I talked about it last weekend at Eric's conference is really understanding three things really, really well. What do you have right now? Does it work for you? Does it make sense for where your business is going? Do I have too much? Am I over provisioned? And then secondly, how much am I paying for that really? And it's funny, I used the example in the conference. I said, raise your hand if you understand your personal cell phone bill and every charge. Nobody raised their hand, including me. I don't understand mine either. I have one phone. And the last thing is, to your point, what do you need moving forward? So you're adding another location, you're expanding, you're taking on a new line of business. Those could all dictate a change in services. So I think really understanding those three factors, and unfortunately, that takes time to really do that. I just don't think owners have the many times the bandwidth or the knowledge to do that. They say, well, I need telecom, obviously, so whatever I have must be working.
Yeah, that's interesting that what I have must be working. Do you find that a lot when you're working with clients is, well, we've just always had that vendor. We've always had that relationship or that service. Is that a trap that a lot of your clients fall into?
Absolutely. Oh, the telecom is fine. Oh, credit card processing is fine. We've used Joe for 10 years. It's fine. We never have issues.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Eric, I know that's something that you and I talk about a lot is just building that reevaluation into whether it's annually or a couple times a year, whatever that looks like. But yeah, that's a big trap for sure that we see as well.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, no, go ahead, Robyn.
Relationships. You want to have friendly relationships with the people you do business with, particularly long term. But if that personal relationship, you're saying, I don't want to upset Joe by maybe looking at other options, I have to question that stance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say that. I mean, the context of the primary context of the conference we did was doing an ROI audit on your business. What are you getting a return on? And that was why Robyn was one of the first people I thought of. So I'm like, and analyzing expenses is one of the biggest things that most small business owners disregard. And to the comment that you made, David, and then Robyn just confirmed is, no, everything's good. I use so-and-so and I've been using them for 10 years and they take care of me. Well, there's whether they have a vested interest in providing the most services to you or whatever the case may be is not as relevant as the fact that human error factors in, right? I mean, Robyn led off with, hey, sometimes they just forget they have 5 phones. Well, you would think that the guy who was managing that account or gal that was managing that cellular account for that particular wireless account for that company, there's a little dated, But they would look at that and say, hey, geez, I noticed there's no usage on 5 of these phones. Do you think we should maybe clean this up? I mean, as a salesperson, if I was my account, I would have said, hey, I noticed you got 5 lines that you're not using service on for the last 90 days or 60 days or whatever it took to really recognize that and say, could we maybe repurpose that? And maybe you need some tablets or something like that. But that's me looking for, hey, you're already spending the money. Let's figure out where we could respend it. Right? But at least you're getting more value out of it. But I certainly don't want you to spend money for no value, right? I mean, that just doesn't make sense. But people don't do that. And we just assume that everybody's got their best intentions. Not everybody's wired that way. More worse yet, they're not thinking that way.
Right.
That's
The other trap that business owners fall into is, I beat up my salesman pretty good. I don't think you're going to find a rate lower than I have.
Oh, nice.
Sometimes that statement is self-serving for your own ego. But I almost always say, think of Schooley Mitchell in some ways like Costco. That's how my friends describe what I do professionally. Yeah. It's not necessarily the analogy I would use, but if it helps them understand it, I'll go with it. We've had 27,000 clients. We're probably going to be able to negotiate a better deal than you as a singular business can get. So the assumption that because I've pressed my salesperson, I'm getting absolutely the best deal ever available, I don't always think that's the case.
Yeah, valid point. And again, I heard that in the conference and I'm like, wow, that's actually a really valid point that I hadn't considered before, right? Because even to your point, even with my best efforts, I'm only going to be able to negotiate a vendor so far. But if you could come in on my behalf and you can negotiate and get a particular vendor to recognize with the value that you guys bring to the table, that's significantly different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking with somebody last week, and they were talking about a software solution that they use, and the price was really good, and the relationship was really good. But then as I started asking questions, one of the things I brought up was, they're really quick to resolve issues every time they happen. And I kind of heard that and said, well, how often are issues happening? They're like, oh, it's like twice a week. And so it's like, you may have a good relationship, you may have a good price, but maybe it's an inferior product that's not going to meet your immediate and kind of long-term needs. So I think just bringing it back to those purchasing decisions is, even if 2 of those 3 things are right, you need all 3 to really make a smart decision.
Absolutely.
So awesome. Well, it was interesting, Robyn, as I was kind of preparing for our episode today. I guess I may have not thought as much about merchant services as I should have. And so really excited to kind of talk to you about that and really the impact merchant services has on overall profitability.
Yeah, it's a huge area, and it's an area that honestly, there's no end in sight for the cost increases. So every April and October, those rates can go up. And again, as I mentioned at the conference, I don't think people realize all the parties that are part of that process. The issuing bank, the merchant bank, the customer, the merchant, the processor. There might be an ISO involved. I mean, there's just, even if everyone just takes a little bit, that adds up to be so much. And it's a very, very confusing area. I've had potential clients say, I know I'm paying too much, but I understand my invoice and I'm afraid to change because I won't understand my invoice.
Yeah.
Very, very confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think honestly, just right there, just that explanation of all of the different parties and those, death by 1,000 cuts that can come with it, I think is really important for people to understand. So I appreciate you kind of shining a light on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of options out there. I think, again, particularly credit cards is an area where people think, well, there's just a couple places I could get it from. But really, there's a lot of vendors out there, and there is a lot of options out there as well in terms of understanding also how your costs relate to the security of the transaction. So the more secure the transaction, the less the transaction fees are. The more unsecure, the higher the fees are. So me going into a business and handing them my credit card and they look at it and they have me sign is the most secure way. Me having a recurring charge on my credit card when I'm not anywhere near the business is one of the least secure ways. So not every business can change how they process credit cards, but we do run into businesses that'll say, I didn't know that. Now that I know that, I'm not going to take a credit card that way anymore because now I know I pay more for that.
Interesting. Yeah. And I was going to add again, the client assessment, handful of client assessments at this point with dealing with relatively larger numbers, $500,000 in credit card processing. And we're going through the numbers, and the owner's convinced, no, I'm only paying, 1.85%. And I'm like, well, if I just add up the fees, the interest rates, the interest you're paying, right, and then I add up the transaction fees and everything like that, your effective rate that you're paying on credit card transactions is like 3.6%. And they're like, well, how could that be? And I'm like, well, you have the contract? Well, most of them don't, or if they do, they barely understand the contract, right? So to your point about the bill earlier. And then as we kind of go through it, we realize, this card is like a Capital One, not to pick on Capital One, but a rewards card for 2%, right? That's one of the more common ones. And that charges more than a standard credit card, right? And a lot of the, everybody knows that Amex charges more, but the more you get into the rewards cards, the much higher those rates are for processing, which I wasn't familiar with, and until we started breaking it down, going through it. I understood a debit card was cheaper than a credit card, but a lot of people, nobody takes the time to say, they give you the card, you don't ask, is this a debit or a credit, and have them swipe it, because most people don't pay attention to it at the transaction. And in this particular case, as a client, that they don't do a lot of over-the-counter transactions, they pay with a credit card over the phone. Well, that's affecting that too, right? So a lot of these things are not considered, and they don't understand that, and nobody explains that to them. And certainly the merchant's not in they may initially have that conversation, but nobody remembers that after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you take all the factors together of the type of card you're taking, your industry, all those things, there's 500 or 600 different interchange rates.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. I was going to say that's impossible to track at that point. I mean, not necessarily impossible, but certainly it would require some kind of automated process to be able to track it all.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. And your software does allow to be able to analyze that on a regular basis?
Yeah, when we are monitoring the monthly invoices, we can see if there's additional fees or charges on there that weren't agreed upon when we originally implemented them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent.
Awesome. Well, and I think as we're talking about, merchant services, but it could be a number of different things. A lot of that's tied to software, right? We're getting more and more software integrated into different parts of businesses. And so as we're looking at implementing, new software, why is it critical then that we ensure that we've got both flexibility and choice when it comes to things like merchant services when we implement that new software?
Yeah, great question. And I'll give a real life example to answer that. I was working with a gentleman who has a pest control company, and they have great CRM software out for trades. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen it. The HVAC guys come into your house, you get a text message with his picture. Joe's going to be there in 20 minutes. This is what he looks like, right? All that stuff is fantastic. What that company may not know is that great CRM might have locked them into a particular credit card processor. So when this gentleman told me which CRM he had, I started doing some research and found out, his monthly charges for that CRM are actually very low compared to other, I would say, equivalent CRMs. But the difference was it locked him into, you have two choices for processing, and neither of those choices were great. They were both, I would say, highly expensive choices. So he said, what are my options for getting out of this? And I said, change CRM, unfortunately. That's the only option you have. If they don't have kind of an open architecture, quote unquote, you're not going to make a change. And that could be why it was so cheap up front, is that they're making some money on the back end. So I think it's just important for, I would say, businesses to understand whatever technology or software they're going to utilize. Think about things like integration, not just with credit cards, but sometimes with telecom. Will it let you integrate, or is it going to force you into their option?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing, and even as my Biz Coaches grows, right, one of the things that we're looking at is there's a couple of software solutions that we're excited about. At the same time, even hearing this, I'm thinking to myself, oh, we need to make sure that the credit card, because right now today we have 7 coaches, but fast forward to the end of the year, we have 25, or into next year where we have 100 coaches. That could dramatically be different, especially if we're locked into one particular or two particular credit card transactions solutions that are much higher because they're locked into the software application that we're intending to use. So when you brought that up over at the conference again, it was kind of like, oh, wow, I should probably do some due diligence on that before we get too far down that path.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole needs analysis. I mean, the other thing that businesses think about a lot is what kind of accounting software does this integrate with? Because a lot of people use QuickBooks. So making sure that that you're aligned, and as much as possible, all of your systems can speak to each other without a human having to intervene and download and upload and download and upload. Those are all things I think to consider.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's a great point. We talk about that automation. As a matter of fact, our last show was a piece of it was about automating processes and systems, and a lot of that is billing and accounting and things like that don't need to be manual transactions anymore. Most of it can all be uploaded. There still needs to be a human eye has to verify that the transactions are set correctly, but the automation of those and when those work correctly, when they're either integrated or either it's fully integrated or there's the links between the software so that they speak, it really changes the dynamic of how much it reduces the amount of work that needs to be done, tactical work that needs to be done.
Absolutely. We were doing a client intake recently, and they told me that we said, well, we'd love to see your online access to this vendor because we can get so much more information from your online account than a paper invoice. And they said, oh, no, we get a paper invoice and we write them a check every month. And it's just struck me as so odd. I kind of tilted my head that you write them a physical check every month. Like, I guess I just took it for granted that everyone would do kind of an auto pay. And, I was trying not to appear judgmental, but I was like, really? Okay.
Very true.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I think, choice, whether it's merchant services or even I think flexibility is another big piece of it, whether it's, how many seats or licenses, right? Those things over time, kind of your point, Eric, and, as your company's growing, maybe you have software that accommodates, 100, but what happens after that 100? Is it drastically more per person, or do you then have to go on the 500 plan, which doesn't fit you? So I think that flexibility and choice is critical for evaluating your current solutions, but also when you're buying new solutions. So makes a lot of sense. Well, we're talking technology, right? I feel like every time I look online, there's a new AI or there's some technological innovation. And so thinking about, business owners that might watch or listen to this, how can they best stay up to date with technology changes in their industry and kind of leverage that for additional cost savings?
I think there's a couple ways. And one of them happened recently with a client I'm working with who said, I was out doing business and there were my competitors and they're doing XYZ and I'm not doing XYZ and I want to do XYZ. So I think it's keeping track of your competitors and what they're doing, smoothing out their operations. In this particular case, the XYZ was using QR codes, which, for some businesses you take for granted, but they have applications across a lot of businesses. And it can be such an efficiency gain where instead of someone taking an order, someone could actually just use a QR code on their phone, which 99.9% of us have in our back pocket, 23 out of 24 hours a day. If I can just go order something on that QR code and it's ready for me when I get there, that for me as a customer is ideal. For the vendor, it's also ideal. I have less people that I need to staff for. It's quicker. The customers aren't waiting as long in line. It's already paid for. So technologies like that, sometimes you just look at what your competitors do and say, I want to do that. I think there's other industries where subscribing to industry publications probably works. Most business owners are probably too busy to read through, a hard copy of an industry magazine, but there's so many online services that will just send you out blurbs about new technology. I think that's where people can find out a lot about what's the next best thing coming down the pipe.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and I think you probably see this when you're working with your clients, Eric. I know you do too. Is just the level of difference between the company that's embracing technology and staying on top of it, and the one that isn't. Whether that's the customer, the client experience, or just the efficiency and their ability to grow. I mean, technology is pivotal now, so it's just critically stay on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, well, and David, you and I actually had a brief conversation earlier today, and it is directly reflective of that strategy, which is somebody that I aspire to as I grow and scale my Biz Coaches. What they're doing is they're basically, they termed it the baby Berkshire Hathaway hedge fund, basically, right? They acquire boring businesses and aggregate them. And in many cases, these are older, dated, almost, I wouldn't say completely dated, but certainly, you know, things that are like a laundromat or a car wash, a coin operated car wash or something like that, where it's as simple as going in and putting a little bit of money into technology and automating. And to your point, Robyn, like for instance, I wasn't even thinking about it when you mentioned QR codes. I mean, I could actually place an order with a QR code. I don't even need a waitress necessarily to take my order, right? And so how much of that would change the dynamic of restaurants? And then I think back to an episode that Dave and I did about AI, and we talked briefly about there's 3 new McDonald's that are being launched. They're completely robotic. Right, entirely robotic, no human interaction that I understand. Outside of maintenance, I think was the strategy behind it. But that in itself says a lot about where things are going. Now, how you feel about that? Like I always say, there's some people are really excited about that, some people not so much. But the reality is as I say all the time, it's kind of where things are going to go. We just need to figure out how to capitalize and take advantage of. In this particular company that I was referring to, they're going in a lot of these boring businesses. They're acquiring them relatively inexpensively, considering putting a little bit of money into it, and automating it, and digitizing things and making things more efficient. And consequently, they take a business that was maybe making a 12 or 15% margin, and they're making it into a 20 or 25% margin, just by being willing to, adapt some of the new strategies and concepts and things like that and integrate into the business. So when we talk about technology, it's one of the first places I go, is there's so many efficiencies, and as long as it's done in a way that it still provides the solution that the client looks for and the experience that the client's looking for. But there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think in addition to technology, staying abreast of your industry also helps you understand trends. I mean, and one of the trends that obviously we're seeing everywhere, at least in merchant services, is the cash discount programs. As a customer, I'm not always a fan of paying the credit card charges myself, but in many industries, things like nonprofits, or if you're a food service and your price point is maybe less than $10, people aren't going to have too much of an issue with it. That's a trend that I talk to people and they've never heard of it before. And so staying abreast of your industry would help hey, let's take a look at this cash discount thing. It might work for us.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Awesome. Well, we've talked about a lot of different things, and thanks for all the insights, Robyn, as we've kind of gone through this. I'm kind of thinking of, again, going back to that person watching this or listening to this, and maybe they're just starting that cost management initiative in their business, maybe even for the first time. What are some of the things that they should be thinking about or looking to do if they want to make significant improvements to their bottom line?
Beyond hiring me? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, absolutely. Should we?
Yeah.
Shameless plug. It goes back to my original statement about knowledge. If you're going to do true cost cutting, you actually have to really dig in and understand what those costs represent. Just to say we pay X in telecom, that's not good enough. You have to really know what you're paying for. What do your invoices look like? What's your contract look like? The other thing that people unfortunately get in the trap of is the auto renewals. Sometimes people will call me and by the time we get their contract, I'll say, you just auto renewed like 90 days ago. And what can't we get out of it? No, not really. You can't always get out of that. So I think a deep understanding, again, the knowledge component of those expenses, and then stepping back and maybe, back into my old role in human resources, get your employees involved. I mean, sometimes who knows better about a certain expense or what's working or not working. And we see that again in client intake where, a higher level manager will say, well, we do it this way. And then someone else in the call will say, actually, if we did it a different way, it would be better. So I think get your employees involved, because They're the ones dealing with the processes at the most basic level. And they can say, this works for us, or, management did this and this doesn't work for us anymore. And so, again, we get that sometimes with our client intake process. So I think it's good to engage your employees in this effort, and top to bottom. Again, going back to my HR days, nothing is more demotivating for employees than to have a company talk about, we're going to do cost reduction, we're going to look at all our costs, and then find out that really only applies to a certain segment of the population. That's incredibly demoralizing, and that will end your efforts immediately.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think about, actually, not that we're beating up CRMs today, but there was a CRM that, the company thought, man, we need all of these features. And we actually talked to the frontline salespeople or the customer service agents. They're like, we only use like 10% of that. And so they could have gotten by with a much more basic or less feature rich solution. But the upper level thought all these other things were important when they really weren't. So I love that, kind of getting buy-in at multiple levels. Super smart.
Yeah, I think sometimes the technology, business owners kind of get entranced by like, woo, this technology is so sexy. Look at that. Look at all the stuff it can do. And to your point, the frontline employee might be like, I'll never do that. I'll never use that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. I would admit that I probably fall prey to that. I look at something and I'm like, oh, this would be phenomenal. We could do this and this and this. And at the end of the day, as we're a growing organization, there's an opportunity to adapt into it. But the reality is, in the beginning, and you made this comment at the conference, you're paying for something you may not need. I think you mentioned it was over the concept of bundles. Of course, that was right after I was talking about sales, probably right before that. And I was talking about how great bundles were to get incremental sales opportunity.
Yes, you were. I remember that. Yes, you were.
But in all reality, as you think about it, I know I'm the one that gets sold on the bundle because I'm like, oh, it's just a few dollars more. But you do that enough times, and next thing you realize, I'm spending an extra couple $1,000s a year, maybe tens of thousands of dollars a year, depending on the budget, on these incremental bundles of services that I don't really ever use, and I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. And when you think it, even on a personal level, right, you're like, it's not that much. It's a few extra dollars. I mean, my internet provider does that to me. My TV provider does that to me. And I'm thinking to myself, I'll bet you even personally, I'd save a few $100s a month if I really actually looked at it more closely like that. And then now take that to a business that's doing a couple of $1 million a year in revenue, and how, depending on how disciplined the buyer is, or whomever's in charge of the vendor solutions, that could spiral out of control really quickly. And to your point earlier, super difficult to try and tear apart and break down and understand what's actually necessary until you actually talk to the field and find out this is actually what we use and this is really all we need, right?
Yeah, and especially if there's been turnover. So, unfortunately, a lot of businesses recently I've worked with, they'll say, I wasn't the person who negotiated this contract. I have no idea what we really are paying for because I wasn't the person who did this. And so now someone has to pick up the pieces and figure out, where is that contract? What is in that contract? What are we paying for? And so it's just much more difficult when you weren't the point person for it.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Great. Well, hey, a lot of really good points. I want to just distill it down real quick to just a couple of key points and action items for our audience out there. I think really for me, the big thing I took away is determine where to focus your cost management efforts and really kind of narrow that list down. Also heard very clearly, thank you, Robyn, to do your research and due diligence when making purchasing decisions. And always important to think about solutions and prioritize solutions that have flexibility and choice. That's critical when you're the business owner. And of course, need to stay up to date on those technological advances in your industry. And then in terms of kind of, immediate action steps, I think making that list of vendors that you use and kind of the annual cost for each, identify the top 2 or 3 that your business can focus on pretty immediately to start to get that cost savings, and then craft that plan to reduce costs, or work with a consultant like Robyn that kind of specializes in those areas to start reducing those costs. So just a couple things to think about from our episode today. Robyn, it's been great to have you with us. Where can our audience go to learn more about you or Scully Mitchell, or maybe some of the stuff that you have going on right now?
Yeah, they can always see me on schoolingmitchell.com /rbowls. All of the franchisees are listed actually by state. So if people are from a different state, I can work in every state, but I also always want to give a plug for my fellow franchisees. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn as well. So they can look for Robyn Bowles on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. And we'll put both of those links in the show notes as well. So if you're on YouTube or watching, you can go in there and click those links to find Robyn.
Appreciate it. And Robyn, one last question for you in regards to your target client base. Maybe give the audience, the listening audience, some of the key things that the key metrics or something like that would reference kind of would definitely make sense to reach out to you and get you involved in a conversation.
Yeah, a great question. I really can work with businesses of any size. Sometimes people say, well, really big companies have purchasing people. I say, yes, and they're all overworked too. So they can use our help as well. But I will also honestly speak to the person who's the solopreneur. There are situations where they won't meet the Schoolie Mitchell minimums. And the minimums, quite honestly, they're in place because you need a certain level of spend to negotiate and drive any savings. It's not as if we don't care about small business, but you do need a certain level of volume. But I'll speak to people, honestly, just to give them advice. If I can prevent someone from making, say, that CRM software error, I will do that. But if you're talking in terms of, say, minimum spend, $750 a month on telecom is kind of, one of the areas that we look at, and that's everything. Again, internet, web hosting, cell phones, landlines, everything. 20,000 or so in credit card processing. So you're putting $20,000 worth of purchases through credit card processing a month. So those are two of the bigger, I would say, thresholds. But again, I'll speak to anybody, because if I can't help them, I can help find, at least through my networking, a vendor that can help them on that level.
Yeah, and you did that for a few of my clients, and I want to acknowledge that and appreciate that.
Yep, you're welcome.
Awesome. Well, Eric, before we ask what's new at My Biz Coaches, you both were part of the Business Mastery Conference over the weekend, put on by My Biz Coaches. So I heard that went really well, and a lot of great feedback from the attendees. Eric, anything that you want to share about the conference or anything new that's happening at My Biz Coaches?
Yeah, appreciate that, David. So we're super excited to announce that we'll be doing the next event in October. I don't want to release the date exactly yet, but we've done our due diligence this time, and a better due diligence, we'll say. And we've nailed down a time frame in October that we feel very confident will be a good date for us. But super excited to the success that we had from the event. Again, I'll openly acknowledge and recognize Robyn. I greatly appreciate your participation, your presentation that you did. A lot of people acknowledged a lot of great takeaways from it. And a lot of great people helped out make that an awesome event. So I could be happier, because you just know me, David. I'm always striving for more, right? But the reality is, at the end of the day, I was pretty ecstatic about the way it turned out when it was all said and done, and we got so much exceptional feedback. I was like, we need to do it again. So I'm excited to announce that we'll have a new one coming up in October, and between now and then, we'll start getting that information out to people sooner.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, if you want to learn more about Eric or connect with My Biz Coaches, head over to mybizcoaches.com. Robyn, Eric, it's been great spending time with you today. Robyn, thanks so much for joining us. It was a blast.
Yeah, thanks, David. And Eric, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Absolutely.
Eric, always a pleasure, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Great. Thanks.